Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Akbar, after all these years, to have a chance to talk to you about your life and distinguished career. You're probably now one of the most famous anthropologists in the world through all your various activities. So, can I just start by asking you about your background, about your, however far back you'd like to go, not like the newer 8 generations or 20 generations, but your grandparents' parents. Anything you'd like to say about them?
Well, Alan, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with you. What an honor to be a part of this series. I respect the work you're doing and the work you have done. So I'm looking forward to the session with you. My ancestry brings together 2 main streams. The Pathan or the Pashtun peoples through my mother, and the Sayyid, the descendants of the Prophet, through my father. And this has always made me very aware of the legacy, the ethnic, the spiritual, the cultural legacy that I am heir to. My mother's father was Sir Hashmatullah Khan, a very well-known person from South Asia, featured in the Who's Who in the 1930s. My father's lineage goes back to many saints, many saintly figures, and that again is something that makes me aware of my own identity.
Right. So, in specific and practical ways, what were the main activities or occupations of your, say, your father's side?
My father, some of the stories that I heard from my father and the way I saw my father practice his faith and deal with people reflected his spiritual position and that of his lineage, which was a kind of universalistic approach to religion, to Islam, to dealing with people. He was a man of great compassion, also great wisdom, and also humble. So I saw him in very important positions. He was an important official in Pakistan and then later joined the United Nations in Bangkok. And I would see him talking, as a very young boy then, but I would see him talking to presidents and prime ministers and to ordinary people, peons and drivers, in exactly the same way, and with the same warmth, with the same understanding, and that left a deep impression on me. The second thing I learned from him was never to make a fuss about one's own personal faith. I never saw him drinking, and he would never say, make a big deal out of it, or say, I'm not drinking because I'm a Muslim or whatever. He'd go to these cocktail parties in Bangkok, and he was invited a lot because he was holding a senior job. He was a director in the United Nations. I'd often accompany him, and he simply would ask for an orange juice or something. And I appreciated this because and this is what I grew up with, inheriting his awareness of himself as a Muslim, and yet his awareness of himself as someone as part of a bigger world civilization, world culture, which he appreciated. So these things helped me a lot in my own sense of my own identity.
And did the fact that he travelled, as you mentioned, Bangkok and elsewhere, did you go with him on any of these travels?
I did, and I think it was partly that created a great interest in me in terms of other people, other cultures. Because I had this sort of strange schizophrenic life. We'd go to Bangkok for the winter holidays from my boarding school up in the northern hills of Pakistan, a school run by Catholic priests. So you had all these strange combinations in my life. Catholic priests, they were great priests. We called them fathers, great figures of discipline, but also very tolerant, very understanding. We got on very well. And then Bangkok, which is a different world, very sophisticated, cosmopolitan, different culture, Buddhist background. And so you had North Pakistan, a Muslim background, and then Bangkok, Buddhist background. And I'd come back to my school, 9 months of boarding school, in a very different environment. And sometimes as a young boy, this can be somewhat bewildering, overwhelming, and would force you to be asking questions about different peoples. Because I found the Thai, for instance, extremely friendly. I found them very relaxed and yet devout. And they had a very easygoing approach to their religion, and yet I found them very devout and expressing great reverence for the religious features that we saw all around us, the Buddhist priests with their shaven skulls, or the temples, or the king, the respect for the king, for instance. At a cinema house we'd see that after the main feature film, everyone in the audience, irrespective of the fact whether you're a foreigner or not, would bow their head as a mark of reverence to the king. And we grew up with that tradition. So this culture which engendered and encouraged such reverence for people who were seen to be figures of authority.
What about your mother? Tell me something about her family and her character.
My mother comes from a different social and cultural background. She represents the Pashtun, the Pathan community or consciousness, or peoples in South Asia. So you see much more awareness of a certain aristocracy, a certain confidence, a certain almost aggressiveness, because Pathans have always believed that they were a kind of superior peoples in South Asia, and South Asia is a very hierarchical society, as you know, Alan, more than anyone else. So everyone had a kind of place in this caste riven society, and the Pathans, of course, had 6 or 7 dynasties which ruled India from Delhi. So they were very conscious of their place in the sun, and she was very conscious of the fact that at some stage, a lot of anthropologists talk about fictitious genealogies and amnesia and genealogy and so on, but many Pathans link up with royal families and with kings in Kabul and so on. So we always grew up believing that somehow we had some links with royalty, and that of course was primarily because of my mother's great sense of, again, self and confidence and pride in her own Pashtun or Pathan background.
Was it at all unusual for 2 such different backgrounds to marry?
Not very unusual. It was unusual because they came from slightly different backgrounds. But remember that the Sayyids, my father's mother was a Sayyid and his father wasn't, so that again there was a slight mix there. That the Sayyids, who considered themselves the superior spiritual lineage because they are descended from the Prophet, and the Pashtuns, who were the men of the sword, as it were, the warriors, these were traditional allies and often gave daughters to each other, often formed alliances. So it wasn't all that unusual. In the context of India, it would have been because my mother came from a slightly different social background to that of my father. My father, of course, was in service. Now, service means something else in terms of the colonial structure. It gave him prestige and power and so on within the British colonial structure.
What about her character? You mentioned your father's self-discipline and lack of demonstration of his religious beliefs. Was your mother?
My mother took a very interesting couple, because in a sense they complemented each other so beautifully. And my mother was much more confident, much more outgoing, much more expressive of her views, her ideas, her prejudices, a very compassionate woman, a great believer, a firm believer in Islam. So hers was, if you like, a confident Islam. Not an aggressive Islam, but a very confident Islam. My father was much more thoughtful, again very committed to his faith, but reaching out. So his would be a much more mystical, a much more inclusivist, a much more Sufistic form of Islam. And these two really formed a great influence in my life. Sometimes the balance between the two worked very well for me, and sometimes I felt it tearing me apart, because in a sense there was a kind of tension within me in terms of these two complementary and yet distinct streams in Muslim society in South Asia.
You mentioned the school. What was the name of the school you went to?
The school I grew up in was called Burn Hall. That's where I was educated, up in the northern hills of Pakistan, in a place called Abbottabad, named after the famous Deputy Commissioner James Abbott, the first Deputy Commissioner of what became the district of Abbottabad. And I would, in my first posting, be posted as Assistant Commissioner Abbottabad. So I was thrilled to be back, not only at the place where my school functioned, but also to have a link with the old abbot of legend. This school was again a peculiar school. It was run by the Catholic priests. It was
which order?
Mill Hill. Very popular, very difficult to get into, and considered itself the Eton of Pakistan. and that isn't a surprise because many of these boarding schools consider themselves as the Harrow or the Eton of that part of the world. But it did produce a remarkable group of people. One of my class fellows became acting president of Pakistan, Wasim Sajjad. Several of them became corps commanders and lieutenant generals and so on. Many ambassadors and distinguished people in Pakistan. I think one of the great things I learned at the school was something again which created great tension in my life in the civil service in Pakistan, was the shibboleth, the absolute belief that we were taught when we were at school, which was to play the umpire, to play the referee. So whatever happened, you had to play by the rules. And we grew up in a society in Pakistan which was increasingly becoming a society where there were no rules. There were no rules, there were no referees, it was a kind of free fall.
What date was this?
Joining the civil service?
No, when you were in the...
Burn Hall, I was from 1950, so I was there from 1952. I did my senior Cambridge 1957 and higher senior Cambridge.
So you were born in...
1943, January, and I joined Burn Hall when I would have been about 10 years old, or a bit younger, and stayed there to do my senior Cambridge and then higher senior Cambridge 1959, and then went on to do a BA very quickly in Lahore, Forman Christians College, and then come to England, first to Birmingham University and then Cambridge in 1965 to do my diploma in education at Selwyn College.
Well, let's just go back a little bit. Was there anyone at the school? Sometimes there is a particular teacher or one or two individuals who influence one for the rest of life.
I think the man who influenced all of us at school, certainly me, and impressed me with his great personality, his great character, his great moral authority, was Father Scanlon, the headmaster of the school. He's remarkable, absolutely one of these outstanding figures. And the story I remember of him was when President Ayub Khan, then Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army, he wasn't Field Marshal then, he made himself Field Marshal later, declared martial law and took over the country. And his education minister came to Abbottabad and rang up Father Scanlon and said, my son is at school and I'd like you to send him to spend the weekend with me. And Father Scanlon said, that's against the rules. You can't have any boy out of school because this is a boarding school and this is against the rules. And he said, do you know who you're talking to? I'm the education minister, and do you know it's martial law? And Father Scanlon said, I'm aware of that, but these are the rules. And he said, do you know you're a foreign priest and I'll have your school closed and have you packed up and thrown out of Pakistan? Father Scanlon said, give me 24 hours, I'm giving you notice, we are packing and we're leaving. Now, by doing this, Father Scanlon did several things. He immediately reversed the threat, he called his bluff, and he created a crisis because the education minister knew that President Ayub Khan's sons, two of his sons, or three of them at one stage, but Tahir Ayub, whose son eventually came here to King's College when I was here, was at Burn Hall. And Ayub Khan had great respect for the school, and there was no question of the school being closed. So when Father Scanlon called his bluff and said, close the school, we're leaving, the education minister simply collapsed and he said, if you don't mind, Father, I'd like to call on you. And then he came down and he was whining and he was being very charming to Father Scanlon and said, what can I do and how can I help you, and you need this and you need that. So Father Scanlon showed us through that incident, which became very famous in school, that here was a man capable of standing up to brute authority in Pakistan at a time of martial law. Now that's a kind of example I don't think we'd be hearing much about, for instance, today in Pakistan. So a lot has changed in Pakistan over the half century that I'm talking about.
Fine. And then, so when you left the school, what did you do?
I left the school after my higher senior Cambridge to really wait for admission in England. This was the kind of route that all people in my school took. We applied to various universities. I applied to Cambridge. We turned up here after about 9 months. During these 9 months I did my BA from Lahore. We didn't take that too seriously because literally just came in, sat for the exam and came out, and even in those 9 months I managed to get a gold medal for history and English, which means topping the exam for the university for Punjab. and then came to England, and I arrived at Selwyn College, and I arrived too late. I arrived in October, September, October, and I was told that it was too late and to come back next year. I also had admission at Birmingham, because my father in the United Nations was a great friend of Walters, who later became famous as Sir Alan Walters, working with Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, yeah.
He was a great econometrician, and he convinced my father that he'd make me a great econometrician. And I was then persuaded by my father and Walters, twisting my arm, to land up with him in Birmingham, where I was extremely unhappy for the first few months, completely out of my depth, because I'm hopeless in mathematics, and econometrics was all about sums and formula. And
So you went to read economics, did you?
Initially. So for a few months I just sat there looking completely dazed and unhappy. And after a while, Walters wrote to my father and said, "This boy is hopeless. I'm sending him to anthropology and sociology," and that's where I moved in, because that's what I really wanted to do. I'd started reading up some literature on sociology and anthropology, and since that time I really stayed with the subject. So that was my first introduction to the social sciences.
How did you first hear about sociology or anthropology?
I think it was at Birmingham itself, the department. We had a strong sociological and anthropological interest. If you recall, John Rex,
Yes.
he was at Birmingham, and he was introducing Max Weber, and this is the early 60s. And it was a very natural fit for me, who in any case, I was very interested in people, in races and ethnic groups. So it was fascinating to be reading about them. I was suddenly reading about people from South Asia, about Muslims and Hindus and Pathans and Sayyids and people descended from the Prophet. And for me, this was like doing something I really enjoyed doing rather than work. So I enjoyed that, and therefore became interested in the discipline. And again, to jump a little bit, when I joined the civil service, where I came to Cambridge for a year to do my diploma in education. Then while I was at Cambridge, I sat for the civil service exam in Pakistan. And the civil service exam then was very competitive. We had about 5,000 candidates the year I sat, and they took about 15 or 20 people for the first, the senior most cadre, which was called the CSP. This was the direct descendant of the ICS, the Indian Civil Service. And the CSP, like the ICS, considered themselves as the twice born, the Brahmins, the upper caste, whatever you like to call them. Although one had to remind them constantly that, like the ICS, they had many flaws. The ICS, if you recall, as a wit put it, that they were neither Indian nor civil nor much of a service. In many ways it was like that for the CSP, because they did consider themselves very superior, and yet there were many shortcomings. But I joined the CSP in the batch I joined was 1966. I sat 65, joined 66, became the 66 batch, and very quickly discovered the match between my scholarly academic interest in anthropology and my professional interests as a district officer. And that match, that passion almost, that fit never left my life, because then throughout my life I've had this twin track, as it were, of a career where I'm either in Waziristan or Balochistan as the head of a division or district, or then at Cambridge or Princeton or Harvard, writing about my experiences in the field.
If we go back to Cambridge, or even Birmingham, were there any anthropologists at that time who you met, or other teachers who particularly influenced you?
John Rex influenced me a lot. He made a big impression on me. For the first time, I began to realize the power of sociology through his work on Max Weber. I was fascinated by Max Weber, and that fascination has not left me. I still remain, I suspect, very outdated and traditional, but I still am a great admirer of Max Weber's, the grandeur and the sweep of his ideas. Here's a man who can talk about comparisons of these great civilizations in a way that few people can do even today, and make sense of our history, make it come alive, particularly through a sociological lens. He's talking about leadership and ethnicity and so on. And through these people, I then discovered one of the most remarkable figures in our discipline, and that is Ibn Khaldun. And I suddenly discovered that here is part of my own legacy as a Muslim, and here was me discovering my own culture thanks to these great Western scholars. And I was discovering that Ibn Khaldun, the man who is considered the father of anthropology, the Ilm al-Umran, this is the man who invents, literally invents, what he calls is the science of man, the science of society. He's talking about cause and effect. He's not talking of society as the rise and fall simply because God likes one particular king and God doesn't like another king and therefore there's a collapse. He's now talking of cause and effect, and he's pointing out how societies work on the basis of certain principles. Now this is absolutely revolutionary and radical because he's writing in the 14th century, and he's writing up in North Africa. He's born in Tunis, he's living in Fez, he's up in Granada. And Ibn Khaldun fascinated me. Not only his theories, which are exciting enough because in one sense or another Max Weber and Karl Marx and Wilfredo Pareto, even our Ernest Gellner here from Cambridge, all of them, and Gellner by the way is a great admirer of Ibn Khaldun, all of them in a sense are reflected, not directly influenced by, but certainly reflected in Ibn Khaldun. But apart from his theories, what fascinated me about Ibn Khaldun is the fact that here's this man reflecting for us today the turmoil, the characteristics, the features of Muslim society then. And that fascinated me, and I asked myself, how is Muslim society treating this man of such great intellectual vitality? And I wasn't surprised at all to see that one day he's in jail, one day he's running across the border, one day he's a minister, one day he's it was incredible that he arrives in Fez and he's honoured and he's welcomed by the king, so he crosses into Granada and becomes an advisor to the king, and very quickly he's being chased out from there because the prime minister gets jealous of him and he's put in jail. And when he's put in jail, what does he do? He begins to write his great
Muqaddimah.
theories, the great Muqaddimah. And then of course he leaves it all in disgust and moves eastwards towards Cairo, arrives there, loses all his books, loses his family in this great shipwreck, and then begins to pick up the pieces. So an incredible life, and he's always fascinated me, and throughout my life I've been referring to him, as it were, as a kind of great personal model for me. And when I was offered the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University, I was delighted that I could have some kind of a link with this great name.
Just on Max Weber, like you, I'm enormous. I think he's the greatest of all sociologists by far. Straight sociologists, not political sociologists. But the one theory of his, prediction of his, which is often now queried, is his rationalization thesis. And we probably come back to this later, but oversimplified grossly, his theory was that religion would play a diminishing role in our lives as rationality spread through various different forms. And this was the belief, I think, even in the 1960s, 70s, disenchantment of the world and religion declining in influence. Recent events and things that you've analysed and charted suggest that he was a bit premature in his pronouncement of the death of religion. But maybe that's not what he was really saying.
I don't entirely agree with your interpretation, because the way I analyze Weber is this. I would look at it like this, that Weber is in fact saying the contrary. He's in fact, the whole Protestant work ethic, etc. He's pointing out how religion shapes society and explains many of the societies that we're living in the West, how religion explains the remarkable developments taking place in Western societies. There's this tremendous engine being driven, and it is being driven by a certain kind of vision of the world, which he calls the Protestant work ethic. Now, what you're talking about, that religion would be slowly phased out or diminished, is to be understood, as I understand Max Weber, through his categorization of societies where bureaucracy is the best form or the most legitimate form or the most desirable form of authority. So when he categorizes authorities, you have bureaucracy, you have traditional authority, you have charismatic authority. For him, the best form, implicit in his discussion, is bureaucratic authority, and that is European in its context, in its development, in its genius, if you like. And there, of course, the logic then is that because bureaucracy is the supreme form of government, you cannot have traditional religion. And I think there may be a corollary that religion is phased out or sidelined. But if you read him in full, as it were, then the importance of understanding religion in terms of making sense of our own societies and our own times, I think is very clear. And in fact, I'm going to be, in the present study I'm working on, doing exactly that, which is to use Weber to an extent, but go beyond Weber, because in some senses Weber is still tied up with the idea of explaining bureaucracy as one form, or as the best form of an evolution, if you like, or a trajectory which takes you to that form of society reflected in bureaucracy. And look at societies in South Asia and China, and work out how these societies are reacting to the world we are living in, and how they are looking at the divine, how they're not only looking at the divine, but how they're interpreting the divine, and how very often they're interpreting the divine through expressions of violence. Now, some of these questions are already answered or hinted at in Weber, and some of them have not been at all considered by him. So I would like to also look at this in this new work that I'm doing.
Fine. Well, we'll continue that discussion another time. Were there any anthropologists, before we get on to your civil service work, were there any anthropologists who, either at Birmingham or, you weren't doing anthropology at Cambridge, but who you met at that time, or who influenced you through books you read, or?
I read a lot of the, I read Weber and so on, but I also read anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, and again was fascinated. These were new worlds opening up to me. And I was fairly young, and for a young boy straight out of Pakistan coming to the West, starting to be reading about Japan or Japanese society was really fascinating, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed it as much as reading, say, literature, as reading. I loved reading P.G. Wodehouse and Rider Haggard and a lot of these stuff, these authors as a young boy. And for me now, this became a kind of alternative way of just enjoying reading. So it wasn't so much as work that I was reading these great books on these different cultures, but as pleasure. This is long before I started doing my PhD.
Okay, well, let's go on. You did the 1 year, and then what?
I did the 1 year at Cambridge, again a fascinating year when I look back in terms of anthropology, because I was, as part of the diploma in education, students were then sent to some school to teach for a couple of weeks. I think it's a term. And I was sent to Sherborne, which is a well-known public school somewhere in the south of England. And I recall a little item that appeared in the local newspaper which said, the curious feature of this term is that a Pakistani will be teaching English to the senior form, or something like that. So pointing out that we've come to this, alas, what's happening to the empire. And I enjoyed that very much, because I enjoyed teaching English. I enjoyed teaching a passage to India to a lot of the youngsters, and they enjoyed it a great deal, because I was able to point out not only the greatness and the grandness of the novel, but some of the interactions of the characters, particularly the main character, Dr. Aziz, who is so beautifully formed, and in literature he's of course so well drawn, because E.M. Foster is basing him on his great friend Sir Ross Masood, who he dedicates the book to. And there's again a link, because my family, my mother's family, has some relationship with Ross Masood's family, Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan's family. So that link allowed me to talk about Aziz and the characters, and the students enjoyed that very much.
So at the end of that year, having done your teaching and taught the British how to English, you went back to Pakistan?
Yes, I sat for the civil service exam. The exam in those days was taken also in London, so you had the centres in Pakistan, and at that stage there was East and West Pakistan. So you could take the exam in Pakistan, in South Asia, or then here in London. I sat here, was selected for the CSP civil service structure, civil service cadre, and went back to join Lahore. Did my training, and then was posted to Abbottabad, and then I got my first full posting as Assistant Commissioner in Okara, which is a subdivision in Punjab, just outside Lahore. Then my posting in Mansehra, which is the frontier province, became the first major posting. With major, I mean a full-fledged posting. The assistant commissioner after I was still under training. Mansehra was a full-fledged posting, and I was there for about a year when we were sent to East Pakistan, because the government of Pakistan sent CSP officers from East Pakistan to West Pakistan and vice versa, in the hope, theoretically, that this would help bridge the gap that was now forming between the two provinces. And that ended in some disaster, because this was 1971, a very turbulent year and a very unhappy year for Pakistan, because this was when Pakistan fell apart. And again, I was really in the front rows of the drama. I was seeing the madness that descended on the land. First the Pakistanis, the soldiers killing Bengalis, and then the Bengali population revolting against authority, and then taking revenge not only against the West Pakistanis, but unfortunately against many hapless Biharis. So I saw a lot of madness around me, and this again simply reaffirmed and reconfirmed for me the universality that must drive us in terms of our understanding of each other and each other's cultures and each other's positions.
You were in Sylhet, you said. Sylhet.
No, I visited Sylhet.
I
I was in charge of Maniganj and Kishorganj. Kishorganj is a subdivision up in the north in Mymensingh district, and famous in South Asian law, because this is where the legendary Niraj Chaudhary comes from.
Oh, yes.
Niraj Chaudhary was based in Oxford, and I have a lovely anecdote.
Tell me, yes. I met him once. I've got an anecdote too.
I was visiting him, and I think it was 90, just before he died. It must have been 1990, I think. And I was told he's not meeting people, he's old, he's frail, and he doesn't like his time to be wasted. So I said, don't worry, he will see me. And they said, what have you got up your sleeve? And I said, the person who was setting up the interview, I said, tell him I was in charge of Kishorganj, the assistant commissioner. And of course, straight came the reply, when do you want to come and have tea? And because he was from Kishorganj, and once I arrived, and they said this, he's not going to let you go and you're going to miss your train, because he had so many questions. This was his ancestral home. And I recall visiting his ancestral home and seeing the rather grand home that he came from. He came from an established landed family. And he was remarkable, because I asked him, I was then printing my book on Waziristan, was being reprinted by Routledge, and we wanted some blurb for the cover. And I asked him, I said, I'd like you to say something for the cover, and he did. He gave me a very, very nice blurb for the cover, comparing me to some of the district officers who had made a name in South Asia, people like Ibbotson, who wrote the Gazetteer and so on. And he said this is part of that tradition where political officers wrote and contributed to ethnographic literature.
How nice. He was a special man. During this time that you were in the... I'm speaking quite loudly because otherwise you can't hear. During the time that you were on these earlier postings, were you already simultaneously doing your civil service work and beginning to do some ethnography, collecting material?
It was, again, I sort of stumbled into the writing aspect, because I had to make a choice. It was a strategic choice. The strategic choice was this, that in Pakistan, promotions and choice postings did not depend so much on merit. Increasingly this became apparent, but in terms of how much time you were able to spend or invest in cultivating the right people. I suppose this happens in all bureaucracies. So it was a choice I had to make. If I was to pull out of the calling on people circuit, or was spending time with the bosses, or asking my wife to visit the boss's wife and so on, and spend time really with myself in my books or taking notes, it would be something that may not be completely appreciated in the service. But I made that choice. I made that choice fairly early, and I suspect helped create a kind of reputation for me that he's a bit snobbish, or he's not very easily accessible and so on. But what I did was, really, whenever there was a big dinner or a series of dinners, in Pakistanis are very social people, I would simply not go. I would simply either just put in an appearance and come home, and then spend the hour or two that I could manage to get out, because district officer's life is very, very busy, to really work on my own notes or my own book or whatever. So that my first book, it's not much of a book, it was a very early scribble if you like, was on Mansehra, my first posting. I wrote something on Aptabad, although I was still an assistant commissioner under training, but I did write a kind of early extended piece on Aptabad based on the Gazetteer, the famous Gazetteer, 1907 Gazetteer of Hazara. And I found that fascinating because the ethnography in that Gazetteer is still, to my mind, today we're talking 100 years later after 1907, is still of the highest possible standard. Because the British who came to that part of the world understood that to really administer effectively and with great purpose and to spread happiness or ensure stability or whatever the motivation was to understand the culture, the flora, the fauna, the folklore, the history of these people. And this is what they put down in these gazetteers. So what I tried to do throughout was to develop that pattern in my own work.
So this, in a sense, was your training in anthropology, was reading these gazetteers rather than...
Yes, in a sense, yes. The gazetteers, and also talking to a lot of the elderly people in my area, in my charge. And I found that they would appreciate it. I found that people who I was administering as an assistant commissioner, later as a political agent, would really appreciate this. If I went to some of the most remote areas, and I have been in my career to areas where, in Waziristan for instance, where no one has been. I went to Birmal. I was the first ever political agent to visit that area. It's right on the international border where it is suspected, we're talking now in 2004, it's suspected that Osama bin Laden may be hiding. And that area, they appreciated the fact that I could quote to them their ancestry. I could talk to them about their ancestor, the famous Sufi saint who lived in that part of the world, or talk to them about some proverbs. They would really appreciate that. So it paid off a great deal, and I was able to pass my time relatively easy compared to some of my successors and predecessors.
Were you not only gathering notes, but did you photograph or film?
Not so much photograph and film, because we are still talking of the 70s and the late 60s, when this photography and film weren't really a popular form of gathering data. But I did write lots of notes and take lots of notes.
And perhaps this is a moment to reflect on some of your predecessors, the colonial officers in whose tradition you are now working.
Well, one of the most remarkable men I met very briefly and only once was Sir Evelyn Howell. Evelyn Howell was a legendary figure who in 1905-6 was political agent, South Waziristan Agency. Now I read of him in a book by Sir Olaf Carrow, who himself was a very famous figure, the last British governor of the Northwest Frontier Province, who wrote the classic book, The Pathans, which is a book which is read and...
How do you spell Carrow?
Carrow, C-A-R-O-E.
Okay.
And his son, incidentally, has become a great friend of mine, Michael Carrow, who discovered me in America, lives somewhere near New Hampshire up in the north where I'm in Washington, and who comes down, drives 6 and 7 hours just to be with me for some lecture or some seminar. We become great friends. Now, Carrow's book, The Pathans, had an appendix, and in that appendix there was a story written by someone called Evelyn Howell about the time that he became political agent in Waziristan. And I read that as a young man, and I thought it was fascinating, because it was almost like Kipling. This was adventure, this was the frontier, and bugles and a tiger, and the great game and so on. And then in 1964 I was asked to have tea with Evelyn Howell. There's a note in my pigeonhole at Selborne College, and it just simply said, cryptic note saying, come and have tea with me. I went across to have tea with Howell. He was translating the great Pashto poet Khushal Khan Khattak into Pashto, along with his friend Sir Olaf Carrow. Now, we chatted. I wasn't very helpful. I didn't know much about Pashto poetry, and I went back to the front, back to Pakistan after having joined the civil service of Pakistan, and in 1978 became political agent, South Waziristan Agency. And in these old papers and books that you come across in some of these offices which are neglected, lying in a pile, moth-eaten, I came across an old, literally decaying monograph, a secret monograph addressed to the government of India in Delhi, going back to the 1920s, when Howell was now in charge of North and South Waziristan, called Mij, which means we. And this was an account, an ethnographic account of the Masood tribe. And it was an absolute gem. It was a gem because when I read it, I said to myself, here I am decades later, apart from the fact that I met him in Cambridge, here I am, and the tribes, the leadership and the understanding of these people is brilliant. And I wrote to Oxford University Press in Karachi and then talked to the managing editor, and I said, look, I've got a gem for you and I'd like you to publish this in the Oxford in Asia historical reprint series. And they agreed. So they published that as part of their Oxford in Asia historical reprint series. Small book, Mij, beautiful illustration on the cover of the Shahood Tangi, famous pass.
It's spelled M-I...
M-I-Z-H. I then sent the book to Karo, who was thrilled because Karo was such a great friend and admirer of Howell. And Karo wrote me a letter, which is in my Waziristan book, in which he said, you know, that very often Howell would talk to him about his days in the service, because both belonged to the ICS, the Indian Civil Service. And he said the happiest days of his life were in Waziristan, because they were the most dangerous. And when I was writing my own book on Waziristan, and it's just been reprinted in 2004, and I wrote a new preface for it, and I quoted Karo and Howell, and I pointed out here's a whole cycle, a span of almost 200 years, because Howell is born in the 19th century, and we have this link, and I then in 2004 talked to the political agent in Waziristan to find out about what's going on there, because the media in America, CNN and so on, are asking me, where's Osama bin Laden hiding? So you know, you have this cycle of 200 years and this continuity in spite of the great transformations taking place. And I quoted Howell's letter in which he had said that the greatest time of his life was in Waziristan. And I said, for me too. And that is quite true, because this was the most dangerous, the most exciting time of my life, although I had held many very exciting posts before and after Waziristan.
So,
Alan, let me just mention Waziristan and why it's so relevant. Waziristan is probably one of the most turbulent places on earth. And this was the place where you had two of the most powerful and the most famous tribes, the Wazir and the Masood. And this was the place which Lord Curzon directly administered when he was Viceroy of India. And this is where you had more troops than at one point in history than on the rest of the subcontinent. So you can imagine the scale of what we're talking about. And in the, I think it was 1920s, when they wiped out an entire British brigade, it just disappeared, because these are the masters of strategy, the Wazir and the Masood tribes, and they had actually blocked them, ambushed them, but blockaded them in this very deep ravine, rolled boulders down and just simply wiped them out. And GHQ just couldn't believe this. This is happening in the 1920s, high noon of empire. Brigades just didn't disappear. And this is of course when the year 2004, the Pakistan army has gone charging in, looking for Osama bin Laden, has had its nose bloodied, lost over 100 people, then charged out, then tried to make peace, then tried to have tribal council, and gone charging in again. So it's a very historical part of the world. And of course, once I was invited to join the Institute for Advanced Study. I was in Waziristan and I got this letter from Clifford Gates, which said that on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study, which has associations with Einstein and von Neumann and some of the greatest names of the 20th century, we would like to invite Professor Akbar to come and join us to spend a year here as a visiting professor. And of course, when that letter went to central government and some of my colleagues, they thought I was just pulling their leg and had invented the letters as a kind of joke. And they rang me up and they said, what's all this about you and Einstein and so on. But in the end, I did turn up at Princeton and spent that delightful year writing about Waziristan.
And you said you had an anecdote about Clifford Geertz.
Well, the anecdote was that they were apparently computing what to pay me, and they were saying that a visiting professor normally in America gets so much pay and so on, and then they asked me tactfully, and I said my official pay as the belonging to the civil service of Pakistan was so many rupees. That translated into a very meager sum compared to the other professors, and so we were in a bit of an impasse in the correspondence when I pointed out that although my pay was very limited, I did have 33 bodyguards round the clock. I had about 8 cooks, and I had about 40 staff servants with me. So if they calculated all their pay put together, maybe it'll give them an idea what I was doing. So that helped them to come up with a more reasonable sum in the end.
That's nice. So you mentioned one of the civil servants, your predecessors, who you wanted to talk about. What about the other?
Karo.
Yes.
Well, Sir Olaf Karo again was a remarkable political officer in South Asia, and helped me to understand why colonization or imperialism, which always has an ugly face to it, it's not pleasant to be colonized by other people who consider you inferior and can kick you around and so on, but that it also has another aspect to it, and that was what you could call the civilizing aspect or the civilized face of certainly British imperialism. And Karo helped me understand that, because in his love for, in his respect for the Pathan peoples, I think he was unrivaled. And his great contribution, his book, The Pathans, is really a tribute. It's a labor of love. He has a whole chapter on my wife's grandfather, the Wali of Swat. And again, it's virtually a love fest. He just talks about him, one of the wisest and greatest and so on. And that kind of respect, the book itself is dedicated to a Pakistani, Sikandar Mirza. And I learned from him that these great gaps that divide us, after all, Karo was a man who served the British Empire. I'm growing up and serving something called Pakistan, which is an independent country with different generations, different cultures, different religions, and yet there was a great bond, and he saw me really as someone who belonged almost to his own service. Always treated me with great affection. I remember visiting him. He came and picked me up. He lived somewhere in the south, Staining, a village in Sussex, and lived in a house, he pointed out, which was constructed in 1707. And we both, because he was a very scholarly man, we both reminded ourselves that was the year when the last great Mughal emperor Aurangzeb died, and that began the downfall of the Mughal Empire. And I took my daughter Amine, who's just got a PhD from Cambridge University, with Babar, my son, to see him and spend the day. And he was very charming to the children, to my wife, and of course, because of my wife's family background, he had great respect for her. So it was something that I think a lot of ordinary people who know little about the relationship between these officers and the peoples they administered would not normally be aware of this particular affection that they had for the peoples of that area.
It is a very difficult thing to get the balance right about the later British Empire. This dual, on the one hand, the patronising, class-based, arrogant, supercilious background to it, and yet in individual cases and in practice often something different. On the whole, I mean, if you could just elaborate a little further about your feeling about the empire and its role and position, it'd be nice to hear anything more you have to say on that.
Well, empires, Alan, are not static. They're changing all the time, and the personnel who run the empires are also changing on the basis of education, the times they live in, the situation on the ground in that particular colony. I think the British were very different after the uprisings or the mutiny, whatever you like to call it, middle of the 19th century, when there were a lot of brutal things done on both sides, a lot of savagery. If you read Hodson's letter, you recall he says, congratulations. You remember someone congratulated him because Captain Hodson is the man who shoots the family, the Mughal emperor's entire male descendants, his sons, his grandson, everyone is just shot in front of this old man. Now that kind of brutal act I find absolutely appalling, because here is the Mughal emperor who is then sent off to Rangoon to die, spend his last few years and die in a bamboo hut. But to have his sons and his grandsons and his male nephews and descendants all shot in front of him is really an act done in revenge and anger, if you like. It's a reaction to what was taking place at that time in the rest of the subcontinent, when the Indians were doing terrible things to the British, to women and civilians and so on. And then there's another phase, and that phase is the one I think that really impressed me. That is the phase in the 1880s, 1890s, and at the turn of the century, when now the British have an awareness that there is this jewel in the crown. The British considered India as the prized possession of the entire British Empire, and that they somehow had to maintain a standard. And that impressed me, because there was, I'm not an admirer of colonization of any kind, but there was a kind of moral authority here. And the example I can give you is of Lord Curzon himself, who, if you recall that incident up in Assam, I think it was, where there was some local woman molested by some British soldiers, some cook killed or beaten up by British soldiers, and the story was reported to Lord Curzon, who ordered an inquiry and then ordered the court-martial of the soldiers, and apparently the whole regiment was either sent to Rangoon or something like that, pretty drastic. And the result was a furor in the empire, because here after all was the pride of the empire, that's the British Army. And here was Curzon prepared to stand up to this and say that if you remove this moral authority, then we are as good as our predecessors. And the argument was that we have to be better than them. Now this spirit, I believe, was communicated to the officers that I came in contact with decades later, people like Howell and Karo. They had this great sense of we are here to serve the people. And that's what really inspired and drove me and some of my generation, because we read about them. We were still fresh enough. I mean, the partition took place in 1947. We were already 66, so it's just 20 years on. It's not a lot of time. We still had gazetteers, we still had notes when we went to took over the charge of an assistant or deputy commissioner. The house was the same, some of the silver was the same, the paintings were the same. So in some senses there was continuity in spite of the disruption and the rupture that took place. And again I found that I could learn a great deal from these officers. The book that Howell wrote, Mij, for instance, has a remarkable conversation with an elder of the Masood tribe. And I think to myself, Howell is talking as a representative belonging to the Supreme Service, the ICS, to a tribal chief. And they're convincing each other of their respective civilizations. And Howell writes, not to the chief, because this is a secret document sent to the government of India in Delhi, he writes that after our prolonged conversations, I'm not entirely sure whether my colleague representing the Pashtun tribes, the Pathan tribes, is not correct when he says that a civilization is to be judged by the kind of men it produces. And leave us alone with the kind of people we have as were our fathers and grandfathers, and you keep your roads and your electricity and your telegraph poles, because in the end we are satisfied with what we are. And Howell acknowledges this. He acknowledges the fact that here's a culture, here's a civilization that needs to be respected. Now that is a remarkable tribute from someone representing one civilization to someone representing another civilization, and a remarkable tribute of the tolerance of someone like Howell. And I think that this kind of tolerance and insight would be very much appreciated in some of the interactions we have today when we have Western troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have so much misunderstanding and we have so many horror stories coming out of the prisons and the torture and the beating up and the complete collapse of any moral authority of these two civilizations interacting. And when I look at events today and compare them to the past, my respect for some of these individuals, not the system of colonization, but the individuals who ran the empire, my respect for them is maintained, and I am able to understand how the empire lasted as long as it did, and why there was still so much affection for these people in the rural and tribal areas of South Asia, irrespective of what the nationalist historians may say or may not say. I, as commissioner, when I was commissioner of Quetta, and I'd go into these remote areas and have what are called these big tribal gatherings, tribal meetings, and I'd start by asking the tribal elders, what can I do for you? And the tribal elders, very impressive biblical characters, would stand up and say, you are the greatest commissioner we have seen since the time of the British and so on. This is standard, they say this to all the commissioners. And then they would say, you can do one thing for us, and that is get the British back. And I'd say, if I'm such a great commissioner, why do you want the British back? And they'd say, we want security, we want stability, we want fairness. And the British gave us that. And I would tend to agree with them that on the whole, you did have many, many officers who were remarkable, who were able to provide this and work around the clock for it. Unfortunately, some of us in South Asia have not been able to maintain that standard. So there are too many stories of incompetence, of corruption, of collapsing, of moral decay that take place and are heard today in our part of the world. So the great moral authority has been affected in terms of this civil service structure that I'm talking about.
Thank you. That was very moving. I've seen some of this in not the northwest frontier but the northeast frontier in my visit to Nagaland and Assam and elsewhere, where I was very influenced by my supervisor who had met many of these district officers. My supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, who had met Mills and Hutton and Hodgson and people like this. I think you mentioned you'd met Heimendorf.
Yes, Heimendorf was at SOAS, and I was then a student registered for my PhD. So I certainly met him. He was always very kind and courteous to me. My supervisor was Professor Adrian Mayer, and I'm delighted that both of them are on your list of ancestors. So I never suspected I joined them on any list, but here I am with them. And they were extremely kind and extremely attentive of my requests and needs and at that stage questions, because I did want to do a regular standard anthropological PhD degree, and this is what I did because I took a year off my studies on my work as a civil servant.
When was this? What year was this?
I joined in 1974 for a year at SOAS. I was on deputation from Pakistan on what's called study leave. Went back to the civil service, became a political agent and so on. But then I took a year off on my own and went into my fieldwork area, which was in the Momand area, because I really wanted to be as anonymous as possible. And very often with my wife, we went into and lived in these remote settlements and villages in the Momand agency, and collected a lot of very interesting data, which eventually became my PhD thesis. And that was published as Pushtun Economy and Society. And that was, of course, we were discussing anthropological works. That was very much a tome. It was an anthropological tome, which went into one edition and died a natural death, unlike some of my other work, which just continued, like Discovering Islam, which is printed and reprinted ever since it was first printed. So that was actually my PhD thesis, Pushtun Economy and Society.
Tell me something about Adrian Mayer, because you were obviously closer to him than to Christoph.
Adrian Mayer was my supervisor. He did his work in India. So his work was more in terms of Hinduism, the caste structure, the village, the Indian village. My work was more Pathan tribes, tribal areas, lineages, political leadership among Pathan tribes, the role of religion, because religion is a very influencing, very strong factor among Pathans. They're very motivated and they consider themselves by definition Muslim, Islamic, not in an orthodox, very literal sense, but certainly in a sociological sense. So slightly different from the peoples he had been studying and dealing with. But again, I found him extremely helpful in terms of putting me on the right path in terms of the discipline of anthropology, the reading list, the comparative literature, and of course pointing out how important it is to keep the discipline of working on a PhD within a certain time frame. Now, I was again on a short leash because I had taken 6 months or 9 months from service in Pakistan. I was about to be posted as political agent Khyber, which is one of the best jobs in Pakistan because you're in charge of the legendary Khyber Pass, which is where all these great historical figures from Alexander the Great down to Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, have come into India. It's a very prized posting, and I had to make a choice again, a career choice. Do I stay on and become political agent, or come to the UK and do my PhD and finish it? And I, of course, came to the UK to do my PhD, and I never ever got the job because I gave it up before. But when I went back, I was then offered Waziristan, and so I went and took that particular job, and found that that was something extraordinary, an extraordinary period of my life.
Right, Akbar. You've now become one of the chief explainers of Islam to the world, which is extremely important at the moment. I was wondering whether you could explain how you got into the position. You haven't mentioned your ambassadorial roles and other things like this. How did you become a wider than anthropologist spokesman for Islam?
Alan, the answer must come from something very personal in my life. My father, who I looked up to and admired and loved immensely, died when I was at Princeton. And just before he died, he had been persuading me to write on Islam. And there was a kind of tension developing between us. He was insisting I write on Islam because he said that is the great tradition of Muslim scholars. You need to be explaining the mystic, the tolerant, the compassionate nature of Islam, both to the West and to Muslims. And I was resisting because I would simply say, look, I'm an anthropologist. I deal in hard facts based in studies at the community level, small-scale societies, face-to-face relationships, ethnicity, tribe, village, and so on. To me, the job of the scholar of Islam is to be a man who is based or woman based in a lifetime of study of the text, of the Quran, and so on. And I'm not that, and I will not be pushed or seduced or tempted into writing on Islam. So this was a kind of ongoing tension between us. And I then was told he wasn't very well. He was in Karachi, I was at Princeton. So to humor him, I scribbled a couple of paragraphs and said, well, all right, at some stage I'm going to do something on Islam. A world-shattering, earth-shaking book on Islam which will explain the history and society of Islam. And I sent it off to him. And I then rang him from Princeton, asking him when he's going to be visiting us, and he said he'll visit in a few weeks' time. And next I rang him, I was told that he had passed away. And that came to me as a great personal blow, because it just shook me, because I wasn't expecting his sudden departure. And I remember walking into my study at Princeton almost in a trance. And a colleague of mine, who's a good friend of mine from India, an anthropologist, she asked me, she said, what are you doing? And I said, I was writing something, and I said, I'm writing a book on Islam. And she knew that what my own thinking was on the subject, and she said, but you're an anthropologist, what are you doing with Islam? And I just said, well, I'm going to now train myself to write on Islam. And that began a strange journey of my own into the world of Islam. I spent the next years traveling in the Muslim world. I, of course, went back to Pakistan, became commissioner in Balochistan of 3 divisions, so it allowed me to see Muslim societies in a different way, because now I was looking at religious training, at syllabi, at what was being taught in the madrasas, which would in the 1990s, in the next decade, become very important in the debate around Islam, and looking at Muslim political leadership based in religion, but all the while reading about Islam, traveling in the Muslim world. And at the end of it, I did write a book called Discovering Islam, Making Sense of Muslim History and Society, which was published in 1988. And that, in turn, was made into a 6-part television series by the BBC, which I presented, which was broadcast in 1993 when I was at Cambridge University as the Iqbal Fellow. I came here in 1988 to Cambridge. So there was a kind of logical progression of my interest in Islam. These things are never planned, but they somehow just look like logical and symmetrical when you look back at your life. And what I found was, when I arrived in Cambridge, the Salman Rushdie affair, the controversy around the satanic verses, was about to explode. And when it did explode, I was sitting in Cambridge, and once again I was just sucked into the debate on Islam. So suddenly I was on television and being asked to comment in all kinds of different forums and platforms on Islam. One particular incident I recall with Ernest Gellner, we were on one of these BBC late night shows, very distinguished panel with Ian McEwen and Antonia Byatt and so on, and Ernest, and they were all after me. It was 1989 or 90, I think, and they were sort of hammering at me and saying Islam is this barbaric religion and you've got these savages and death threats and so on and so on. And I was finding it a very exasperating evening, because they were actually suggesting that Salman Rushdie is the new prophet of Islam, he's bringing a new kind of Islam, we should all follow that. When Ernest Gellner intervened, very clearly, very strongly, very sharply, and Ernest was like that. We were great friends. I had immense respect for him, and this was one of the times in public he came in. And when I came home to Cambridge late at night, we drove back with Ernest, driven by the BBC. I got calls from the Muslims who said, what a wonderful colleague you had, he spoke so well for Islam. And they said, as for you, why do you refer to him as Mr. Salman Rushdie? You should be abusing him, you should call him you mother so-and-so, you sister so-and-so. I said, look, this is not quite the way you talk on the BBC. It's not a good way of persuading people. And this problem then remained, because I continued to be involved in the public debate about Islam. With the success of the television series Living Islam, it gave me a platform to continue to write about Islam. I wrote a book called Postmodernism in Islam, Predicament and Promise, which was nominated for the Amalfi Award, and that in turn has just been reprinted. Then I wrote other books. I wrote books on Muslim political leadership based on the life of Mr. Jinnah. I made a feature film on Jinnah. I had a documentary on Jinnah, because I was asking myself, based at Cambridge, two big questions which people would be asking after September 11. I mean, these would be the central questions. What is the nature of Islam? Is it a violent religion? Is it a religion of tyranny, of anarchy, of threat and terror? Or is it a religion like the Abrahamic faiths, rooted in essentially an idea of a world society which has to have a balance between compassion and piety, between tradition and the here and the now, and so on? The big question, number one. And number two, if this is the case, that we've defined Islam, then who's speaking for Islam? Is it the religious cleric? Is it the political leader? Is it the representative of the state? And in a sense, the 1990s for me was a decade in which I was involved in answering these questions in a very public way. So I was, from some anonymity, pushed or hurtled or thrust into a kind of limelight, where I was answering these questions in a very public way, and therefore also able to influence people, certainly in Muslim society and non-Muslims. In 1990, I was asked to come down from Cambridge to London, to the Royal Anthropological Institute, and give a lecture on Islam to Princess Diana. And I found that a fascinating experience. It's all recounted in a book called Diana, Her Last Love, which was published, I think, about 3 or 4 years back, a whole chapter on it. Diana, I found very wonderful, very warm, very attentive to the talk on Islam. And when it ended, she came up and talked for a couple of minutes. I presented her my book, Discovering Islam, and she was so sweet, to any author's dream. She stepped out outside the Royal Anthropological Institute to a battery of cameras, and with the book facing the cameras. So that next day, this glorious photograph of hers, and this was the time when she was still very much HRH, with her holding my book, was in every newspaper in England, and I believe my publisher Routledge called an emergency meeting to discuss what the fallout was in terms of publicity and the book that they had managed to get onto to the princess. So I found that the debate on Islam had now become not only confined to scholars on campus, but had begun to appear in public life in the West. Prince Charles, I was again very fortunate. I was involved with him to some extent in his understanding of Islam. I was with him at Oxford when he gave that famous talk on Islam in the West. I met him several times and was able to exchange ideas with him. And again, I found him very sympathetic and very understanding of Islam. And again, attempting to reach out and create bridges. Later in the 1990s, I was much more directly involved, and again, it was a logical progression in terms of moving from an anthropologist looking at small-scale societies and an anthropologist beginning to try to apply the principles that I had picked up as an anthropologist looking at these societies to a global civilization, and then a global civilization interacting with other civilizations. So when I was asked as the first Muslim to give the Rabbi Goldstein Memorial Award lecture at the synagogue in St. John's Wood, I think is the progressive and liberal synagogues of the UK, first Muslim ever. That event created great national interest, so television, radio, everyone was present, including the police, because a lot of young men on both sides were unhappy that this was happening, and a lot of tension in the air. But I turned up there with a large number of Muslims. Lord Nazir Ahmed was one of them. He'd just become a lord in the House of Lords, and we had a terrific reception. It was a full house. After I spoke, I had a standing ovation in the synagogue, and that helped to thaw relations between the Jews and the Muslims in the UK. Just before that, I think I was the first Oxbridge Don to speak at Evensong in Selwyn College Chapel. Once again, I had lots of Muslims. So all these attempts were being made by me in a sense as an extension of my own understanding of Islam, and in a sense an extension of my own father's vision of Islam as a religion of compassion and peace, embodied in this famous Sufi saying from South Asia, Sulle Kul, or peace with all. This was the great motto of the Sufis of South Asia, which my father believed in. And this was allowing me to play that particular role. And this was, of course, before I arrived in America, where from Princeton I came to Washington and took up the post of Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University in Washington in August 2001. And on September 11, I was in my class with a very distinguished guest lecturer talking. We were talking about interfaith and understanding and so on, when students ran in and out. Some had cell phones, there was a look of horror on their faces, and they said these towers, twin towers, had been attacked and demolished, and Pentagon, and there was complete chaos after a while. And I suddenly realized that the topic of Islam, the subject of Islam, my civilization, my religion, would henceforth be at the center of the debate in the early part of the 21st century, because the necessity to explain Islam was now upon us as an urgent task and duty. And certainly for any Muslim scholar, there was no longer the option of sitting as a neutral scholar in the ivory tower writing learned and erudite texts about 12th century Sufi poetry, but that Muslim scholars had to be out there in exchanging ideas, interacting with people, and really explaining the nature of Islam in an attempt to calm things down and to create bridges. So in a sense, a lot of the last 2 decades was leading me to the point of September 11 and allowing me then to play the kind of role I was able to play, because immediately after that, it's been 3 years and I don't think I've had one peaceful 24 hours without some major media intervention. Before coming to you, I've done my BBC. Last night I've done my Voice of America. So this has been going on non-stop. And I'm supposed to be on holiday here at Cambridge with my daughter. So this has been largely a period, I feel, a period in my life in which I've been able to give back, as it were, to the community, to people I know, whatever little knowledge or whatever little learning I've had or experienced in my own life, in an attempt now to do something with this, with these ideas and this experience and the knowledge I have.
Thank you very much. Well, that is very good to have. Just continuing on one or two of those themes. Firstly, Ernest Gelmer. You said that he was very constructively helpful on one occasion, but you said to me, and he was a great patron of mine and friend, and we pursued the same intellectual puzzles for many years. Is there anything more you'd like to say about him?
I would, because Gelder and I had a very interesting relationship on one level, on an intellectual level. We worked very well together. We in fact did a joint project. I was asked by Routledge to write a book on postmodernism in Islam, And I suggested to Ernest, I said, how about doing it together? So let's both of us look at this. And he immediately responded positively, and I got my friend at Routledge, Dr. Chris Rojek, to come up. We had lunch at King's, and we in fact wrote up, he wrote his book, I wrote my book, and they're both still in print and doing well. On another level, a little known story, I came to start my PhD program at SOAS in the 1970s, completely unknown, from Pakistan, arrived at SOAS, and I wrote up, before my PhD, in a couple of weeks, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks exactly, a book called Millennium and Charisma Among Pathans. And with the gall and the cheek and the arrogance of the ignorant, I sent it off for publication to Routledge. And they said either this is going to be very good or it's going to be terrible. So they didn't want to take a risk. They circulated it and people weren't sure what to do with it. They even sent it back to my own department, and the department said, well, he is a student, he's here registered for a PhD, but whether he's in a position to write this book and have it printed, which in a sense is challenging some very established names like Frederick Bath on the Swat Pathans, we are not very sure. And I was saying something which I thought was very important, that the importance of religion, for instance, to Pathans, to Pashtun societies. I thought that was underestimated or overlooked by Bath, the importance of the Wali of Swat, and many other points I was making, and sometimes just getting ethnography plain wrong. I pointed all this out in the book, so it was still a little bit controversial coming from someone who had no status in the discipline, until the manuscript landed on the desk of Ernest Gellner. And Gellner not only stepped in, writing to Routledge, but Gellner said, not only will I support this, but I will write the foreword to the book. And Gellner's own book, if you recall, had a foreword by none other than Lord Bertrand Russell. So I was absolutely thrilled, and I never forgot this, because the psychological impact of having someone just stepping up and like a traditional guru who would do these things, so to say, well, here's the student, I'll support the student for whatever reason, made a deep impact on me. So that 20 years later, when I was asked by the Times to write a column, they have a column called Past Masters, the Times Higher Education Supplement, I selected Ernest Gellner as my past master, and I pointed out as a kind of tribute to him what he meant to me as a guru figure. And I concluded that essay by saying that we are a very unlikely pair, because I'm from South Asia, I'm a Muslim, he's East European Jewish, he's a philosopher, of course an anthropologist, but primarily rooted in other disciplines. I'm a straightforward anthropologist, and yet when in our world, when people talk of figures so diverse, we can point to someone like Gellner and myself, where there is so much that is also in common. And what binds us is this great common humanity and mutual respect we have. So that was Gellner. He was a very modest man. I was given some kind of an award by the British Council and in Cambridge, and the Pakistan High Commissioner came up, and Gellner was there in the audience, and I acknowledged him. I said, I'd like to acknowledge my guru. I called him my guru, and predictably he squirmed with embarrassment, much to my delight. But I certainly miss him. I certainly miss him because I miss his integrity and his sharp intelligence and his friendship.
One further question which links Gellner and Islam. One of my abiding impressions from his book on Islam is that he felt that if you divided the world into systems where things had not been separated off, where religion and politics, religion and kinship, religion and economics were all fused with each other. If you have those kinds of systems, and you have a modern world in which you live with the divisions, that economics is economics, politics is politics, religion is religion, he put Islam on the side of the undivided world. In other words, politics and religion, which he mainly concentrated on, were fused together, which was a characteristic which shows why he was interested in it alongside his other great interest, which was in communism, which has the same ideology, and politics are fused together. And from this I interpreted him as suggesting that there is a serious problem, that this isn't confined to those two cases. Roman Catholicism is another example. Buddhism, to a certain extent, is another example. Hinduism is certainly another example. In other words, nearly all ideological systems that the world has ever known fuse politics and ideology. But the modern predicament and difficulty is to try and create a world in which these things are held sufficiently apart that you have enough autonomy within each realm. And therefore, I think he always felt that there was a fundamental difficulty in accepting an Islamic civilization, however much he respected it and loved it and was intrigued by it. He felt it was a closed, in his metaphor from Popper and others, it was a closed system, which therefore had difficulty in coming to terms with a divided modern world.
Yes, at the same time, if you recall, in Muslim society and other works, he makes some very interesting comparisons between Islam as a system and other modern systems like Marxism. And he points out that whereas each system has been assailed by modernity and in a sense is either damaged or collapses or mutates or distorts or changes, Islam remains whole. And while it may have its weaknesses, and some you pointed out, it nonetheless manages to then survive as a whole. Because in some senses what he is saying is what the reality is, which is what I would say, that when you begin to chop up Islam, then it is no longer Islam. The dilemma for Muslims is how to preserve the essence of Islam and yet live in the world today. That is the challenge. It isn't so much to chop it up so that somehow it then fits into what we know as modernity. And this is an ongoing debate. I mean, I myself am now engaged in a precisely a similar study of comparative civilizations to come up with some answers. For instance, I find that Islam interacting with Judaism and Christianity in the Middle East is one civilization, and we are familiar with the Abrahamic civilization. So some of the arguments, some of the theological arguments, the doctrinal, the sectarian arguments are familiar. After all, we are working in a frame of reference which is very familiar to all three faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. We may have our differences, we may have different ways of looking at whether it's Jesus or whether it's even the afterlife, but overall there is a great familiarity. Now you move Islam into South Asia, your region, and what do you see there? Islam, 1,000 years ago, it comes into a world where there's no notion of one God. There's a notion of caste. There's no notion really of the afterlife where you're going to be judged and you either go to heaven or to hell. There's a sort of much more cyclical way of looking at existence. You don't have revelation, you don't have prophethood, you have a very different world. And a world which is not only ancient but sophisticated, cogent in terms of its arguments, its philosophy, its architecture, its art, its culture, and not easily swept. It isn't going to be either seduced or just swept aside, like Zoroastrianism is when Islam comes to Persia. So now Islam faces a different world civilization, which is in the majority in terms of population. So how does this world civilization, encountering another world civilization, react? And here are two responses. One is the militaristic, the martial, where you have the classic example of Mahmud of Ghaznavi, sword in one hand and some say Quran in the other hand, who comes in, smashes the temples, smashes the idols and says, I'm Abrahamic, I'm going to impose my vision of the world on you. This is all mumbo jumbo, you worship stones, you worship elephants and you worship snakes. And the other response, the more durable, the more permanent, the more universalistic, and the more, I believe, relevant today is the response of the great scholars and saints of South Asia, as typified by Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer. And they believe in the philosophy of Sole Kul, peace with all. And in essence they're saying we are creatures of the same God, different paths, but ultimately the same divine being that we all look to. And they go back to the Quran for references. And the Quran says, we have made you into different tribes and different nations. The Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. So there's a very strong theological base for what the Sufis are doing in South Asia. So once again you see two different distinct responses to a political reality which has been forced upon the Muslims because of the historical experiences that they are encountering at that particular time in history. We in the 21st century are looking around for what kind of Islam will endure, or what kind of Islam can we interact with. And I believe that this particular encounter that Islam has in South Asia has much to teach us in the 21st century. Because if you look around in the Middle East, you will not come across many examples of that kind of synthesis between an Abrahamic faith and a totally non-Abrahamic faith, like we do in India. You will not come across many examples of a genuine democratic movement, as was the movement around the Pakistan movement in the 1930s and 40s, led by Mr. Jinnah, who is above all a Democrat. You may like him, you may dislike him, but he symbolizes democracy, women's rights, human rights, the constitution, respect for law and so on. He wants, his vision is a modern democratic state. Now you will not have many examples of either this Sufistic synthesis or the democratic model provided by Jinnah and the Pakistan movement in the Middle East. And that is a problem, because the world, when they talk of Islam and they talk of modern Islam, the problems with Islam look automatically at the Middle East, and they look around the 22 countries, 300 million people, and say, where are the Democrats? Where is the tolerance? They are nothing but dictators. The landscape is littered with dictators, and we have a problem. Therefore, the need for scholars to constantly point out that it is a global civilization, and that there are many variations of it, and that it is in the process of change and adaptation like world civilizations, and that we need to be engaged with this particular debate taking place within Islam.
That seems like a very good point at which to temporarily halt our interview anyway. Thank you very much indeed, Akbar. That was fascinating.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.